Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to tonight's lecture, Genocide Prevention, the Troubled Fate of a Post-War Ideal, which will be delivered by Scott Straus, this semester's Marcus Bierich Distinguished Visitor. Scott will discuss the problem from hell, as Samantha Power famously labeled it, and more specifically, the litany of recent and ongoing mass atrocities throughout the world, and what, if anything, remains of the post-war promise to prevent them. Before introducing Scott, I'd like to just say a few words about this distinguished visitorship, under whose auspices tonight's event is held. Established in 2013 by a group of very generous donors, this visitorship honors the late Marcus Bierich, a remarkable business leader who bridged, as few others could, the gap between business and the humanities. At a time when the need for leaders who can think broadly, critically, and compassionately about global challenges is more important than ever, Bierich's legacy feels deeply relevant. He himself studied philosophy and mathematics before embarking on a very distinguished career in finance and served as the Chief Financial Officer of Mannesmann AG, now Vodafone, and he was also CEO of Robert Bosch GmbH. His career trajectory reminds us that deep thinking, even philosophizing, and ethical business practices are not mutually exclusive. This visitorship continues that tradition, supporting scholars and thinkers who excel at making complex ideas accessible to a broad audience, a mission that Marcus Bierich cared about passionately. Among the roles of Marcus Bierich distinguished visitors here at the Academy are such outstanding figures as political scientist Francis Fukuyama, Pulitzer Prize-winning literary historian Stephen Greenblatt, documentarian Julie Cohen, and historian and out-of-sight crazy polymath Adam Tooze. This semester, Scott Straus joins this illustrious list, and we're thrilled to have him. Now to the introduction. Scott is one of the foremost scholars at work today on some of the world's most intractable problems, including political violence, genocide, mass atrocity, civil war, and conflict prevention. Geographically, his work is most focused on sub-Saharan Africa, but as a scholar of genocide, his work takes him into Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He is professor of political science and international studies at the University of California, Berkeley, which we have all learned here over many years to call Cal, because that's what they call it. He is also the chair of the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science at Berkeley. Now, we don't that often have departments with people's names on it, but I thought I would say the whole thing in case there was anyone who felt inspired, like they wanted to endow something department-sized here at the American Academy. Are Mr. and Mrs. Travers still around?
Their children are.
Their children are excellent. Well, we would take care of that endower's children as well. Anyway, prior to coming to Berkeley in 2021, I believe, which, by the way, is about as different from the places that Scott studies as could be. He spent many years on the faculty of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He began his career as a freelance journalist based in Nairobi and covered the first of many, or one of the first of the many never-ending wars in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He has written or edited 9 books, and among single-authored ones, there's The Making and Unmaking of Making and Unmaking Nations, War, Leadership, and Genocide in Modern Africa, which came out in 2015, for which he was given the Grawemeyer Award. That's how a German would pronounce it. Is that how an American would pronounce it? Grawemeyer. Okay. Award for Ideas Improving World Order, an incredibly prestigious prize. And among the others who have won that are Mikhail Gorbachev, former Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, who co-founded the Crisis Group, and Francis Stang, who was one of the pioneers of the idea of responsibility to protect, along with such scholars as Samuel Huntington, Robert Jervis, and Robert Cohane. His book, The Order of Genocide, Race, Power, and the War in Rwanda, which came out in 2006, also garnered a variety of awards, and he has published articles in a wide array of the leading scholarly journals. He's received fellowships and support from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the United States Institute of Peace, or I should say of Peace, Blessed Memory, a place where I also spent a year. I've known Scott for about 15 years, and from the beginning I've admired his extensive and practical engagement in activities that do not make a significant difference in tenure reviews or scholarly evaluations. He's a former member of the Council of the U.S. Holocaust Museum and a current member of the museum's Committee on Conscience, its advocacy arm. He was a member as well of my own board of visitors when I ran the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth. And yes, if that's a giveaway, he is a Dartmouth grad. He was also one of the key architects of a project that remains one of the things I'm proudest of that the Dickey Center did together with the Holocaust Museum, called the Early Warning Project. That is hosted on the museum's website, and it gives a vast amount of information on those countries currently most at risk for mass atrocity events. It is a terrific tool and a wonderful educational instrument with all kinds of very, very straightforward information and very sophisticated statistical modeling on these hotspots. So I recommend you have a look. Just Google Early Warning Project. Anyway, the last reason that I've been trying to get Scott here for several years is because he is undoubtedly the second most influential person in the Academy community who has never been to the Academy. Now, you might find that puzzling. Number one is a trustee who will remain nameless. Scott is number two because he is the current chair of the Academy's Independent Fellows Selection Committee, and that's the group that picks the Academy's fellows. So there are some of you here tonight. I'm looking at some of you who I'm looking at our spring fellows, and you should really be especially grateful for Scott. And very warm, because without his work, we would not have had such a succession of great classes. He doesn't know it yet, but he's also a future fellow. And he has done an absolutely masterful job and given an enormous amount of time to the fellow selection. We now get 10 to 15 applications for every spot. I think Scott reads every word of every application, over about 300. And so he's really been a huge friend in terms of taking on what is a really big task. Just a little housekeeping. I'm not going to say how long his remarks will last because the last person I did that for went on twice as long. That will be followed by a brief on-stage discussion, and then we'll have audience Q&A. If you're here in the room, please raise your hand to ask a question. If you're joining us on the in the streaming website, please type your question in the Q&A box below after accepting the pop-up. In all cases, we hope that your question is indeed a question. And now, Scott, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction, and thank you all so much for being here, and thanks so much for having me at the Academy. It's a true honor to be here, and I've been taken incredibly well cared for. So it's the staff here are truly amazing. So it's a special place, and I'm really glad to be here. So today, my main objective is to take stock of the post-war ideal of preventing genocide and similar types of mass atrocities. I see this as part of the legacy of the Holocaust. And so to me, even though many of you who live here, this will be familiar to you, but to me, sitting here across the lake from the villa where the Wannsee conference took place, it's deeply meaningful to me. And it's deeply, I think, meaningful to be thinking about the question that I'm posing here in Germany at this time, and something to which I'll return in my conclusion. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this ideal of preventing genocide is in an existential crisis. The ideal has been and continues to be gravely undermined, most recently by a shocking threat from a leader of the most powerful military in the world to destroy a civilization, a threat that his supporters believe was effective, which is perhaps the scariest part. But the crisis is deeper and broader than that, in that we appear to be losing a consensus that international cooperation and attention should be focused on stopping or trying to mitigate genocide and mass atrocities. And to illustrate this, I wanted to start by bringing our focus for a moment to Sudan. This is a satellite image of El Fasher in Western Sudan, in the Darfur part of Sudan, in late October of 2025. And you may not be able to see some of what's being shown here, but it's a satellite image showing essentially blood-stained sand. And I'm sorry to be giving this talk after dinner. I want to acknowledge that. But this is essentially a satellite image of a massacre that happened in late October of 2025. And the Sudan crisis is extremely complicated, and I would be more than happy to discuss it in the Q&A. It's a crisis we're entering. Tomorrow actually is the third anniversary. It's been going on for more than 1,000 days. It's often called the world's most gravest or world's greatest humanitarian crisis, with more than 150,000 civilians killed, more than 12 million people displaced. The scale of the violence is truly extraordinary. I want to draw your attention, I think, to three elements here. The first is the technology. This is a satellite image. The ability to basically detect and document crimes of this magnitude is in a way greater than it's ever been, and I'll come back to that in my conclusion. The second is these images and these satellite images were also used recently by a UN independent commission of inquiry, or fact-finding commission, that declared that what was happening in Sudan had all the, quote, hallmarks of genocide, and they used the kind of technology that exists. But the fact that that documentation and the use of this technology is also quite important, to which I want to draw your attention. But third, and perhaps most importantly, perhaps with some exceptions in this room, I suspect very few of you, very few of anyone really outside of the region, has an idea of the scale of the violence that's been going on in Sudan for the last 3 years. Now, you could say that this is typical of crises in Africa, that they don't get the attention that they deserve, and that's certainly true. But if you contrast the lack of attention to what's happening in Sudan to what happened in Sudan 20 years ago, there is a really significant contrast. So this is an image here of George Clooney and Elie Wiesel at the Security Council. They were part of a complicatedly named coalition called Save Darfur, but nonetheless a coalition that involved civil society actors, academics, human rights lawyers, a variety of interest groups around the world, multiple governments, and ultimately parts of the UN. That were using the classic elements of a human rights campaign to draw attention to what was a major crisis of violence in Sudan 20 years ago. And here is Mia Farrow with her Darfur shirt, also as part of that campaign. So I draw your attention to this contrast to invite you to reflect on what it means. And I think I do so again, especially here in Berlin, to think about that question where we are surrounded by a truly extraordinary effort to memorialize and recognize the atrocities of the past. So my overall conclusion for this talk is that while the broad architecture of preventing and accounting for genocide and mass atrocities, an architecture to which the Save Darfur movement belonged, is in crisis. While it is in crisis and severely weakened and at existential risk, nonetheless, it's also still in place and its future remains indeterminate. And I think our job today is to analyze it honestly, and I think rekindle the principles that gave rise to that ideal. We need, I think, to defend those principles because I think what has been gained will be lost if that's not done. From the bottoms in World War II to the Cold War and then in the 1990s, which I'll describe in a minute, substantial progress has been made toward the promise of never again. Today, I'll offer a critical assessment of that progress, but the change was real and largely came from committed people who wanted to ensure that the non-repetition of the mistakes of our past. If we lose those gains, both the institutional progress, but also the ideals and hope behind them, our world and the legacy of the Holocaust will be much diminished. It will be a world where we stand by and watched unmitigated terror and brutality. In short, I think there are principles and politics here that are worth fighting for. And again, saying so here in Wannsee is particularly resonant. So in the remainder of my talk today, I want to do 5 things. First, I want to trace the history of genocide prevention, starting with the aftermath of World War II and then taking us through the early 1990s. Then I want to trace the significant progress that was registered in the aftermath of Rwanda and Bosnia in particular in the 1990s. Third, I want to offer an assessment. What did we learn from that? What worked? What did not? And I do so in part because I hope one day there will be a rekindling of this ideal, and we should come back to what it is that was gained and what worked and what did not work. Fourth, I want to underline the intense headwinds to this agenda. It goes well beyond Trump. The collapse of American global leadership and around democracy, human rights, and international law is certainly a part of the story, but it's a bigger geopolitical story that pertains to failed interventions, changing global politics, and I'm also afraid the fallout from Gaza. And finally, I'll conclude with the observation that all is not lost. Much of the architecture remains, and in some technical ways, is much better than it was. The real challenge, I think, is how to reinfuse interest and idealism into this agenda. And while I'm not optimistic, I think it is incumbent upon people like me and others who care to make the case. To make the case not only for those who face future violence, but also to make the case for the kind of world we want to live in. Okay. So the past. So the history I want to start with may be familiar to some of you is that of Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin was a complicated figure, a Polish-Jewish jurist who was dedicated to using international law to outlaw major crimes against human populations. He trained in Lviv, in what is now part of Ukraine. He's the same place where Hirsch Lauterpacht, who kind of invented the term crimes against humanity, also trained. Lemkin went on to work as a prosecutor in Warsaw. As a young man, he was horrified by the Armenian genocide and initially developed a law against what he called barbarity and tried to promulgate that as an international law between the wars. Ultimately, that effort was shut down because of the rise of the Nazi Party. After World War II started, he ultimately fled, made it to Sweden, and then eventually to the United States. Lemkin essentially lost his whole family in the Holocaust, but he went on a mission, and I think it was a mission, to use law to ensure the non-repetition of these crimes. In particular, he published a massive book in which he documented Nazi crimes in occupied territories, and in which he invented the word genocide. So this was an invention in 1944, although he probably started using the word in his writings in 1943, but 1944. It's a word that combines the Greek for genos, sort of signaling kin or tribe or descent group in some way, and the Latin sede, or killing, and the idea, his core idea, is the organized destruction of groups, in particular for him, descent groups, descent-based groups. When the war ended, Lemkin went on a lobbying campaign to have an international law to prevent genocide. And at the newly formed United Nations, he also succeeded in getting the term genocide into some of the indictments at the IMT, at the Nuremberg trials. But they did not appear in the final judgments. It's a whole long story, which we could talk about. Okay. I think his most sort of significant achievement was the passage of the 1948 Genocide Convention. The formal title is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The achievements here was this was the first time you have a law that codified genocide as a crime. And it defined genocide, and the complicated definition, which we can talk about, is intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such through 5 possible acts. You had to have one of the 5 acts, but the key part for genocide is that you have to show that there is this intent to destroy certain kinds of groups in whole or in part. The convention is also significant in the sense that it obligates states parties to undertake to prevent and punish genocide where it occurs. And what is particular about this is this obligation to states to act to prevent the crimes. It's different from other human rights treaties in that way. And in a way, it's the first promise of making sort of never again, if you will, making it real, or at least making it real in law. Okay. So it's a problematic convention. I'm happy to talk about why, but it was in many ways a significant achievement. Okay. Now I'm going to skip over a lot of history here, but despite this achievement, his vision of how this law could be used and the attendant human rights vision that went alongside this development in the late 1940s effectively disappeared during the Cold War. So there were multiple episodes of mass violence during the Cold War, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in places like Indonesia, in Bangladesh, in China, in Burundi, in Guatemala, in Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And of course, in Cambodia, this is an image here of someone who was taken into Tuol Sleng, or S21, which is one of the torture centers of the Khmer Rouge during the Khmer Rouge's rule. It's not to say that in each of these cases there wasn't some kind of outcry. There often was, but there was no international effort to try to stop these crimes. This was not an international problem. It was very much relegated to the margins of the Cold War. Now that changed at the end of the Cold War. However vague and problematic, there was the ideal at the end of the Cold War that there could be a reset for the United Nations, there could be a reset for human rights and humanitarianism, even if people would learn quite quickly that those ideals were difficult to achieve. Okay. Now this sort of ideal was first evident in Somalia, but the real shock and the real turn, at least in terms of the story I want to tell, was from Rwanda and Bosnia. And specifically with Bosnia, with Srebrenica, a case that was quite dear to Richard Holbrooke and hopefully to those here at the Academy. My own entry point was Rwanda, as Dan mentioned. I had been a journalist in the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda. I spent a lot of time in that region. I ultimately did my doctoral research on Rwanda, and it remains a place that's very important to me, a core interest for me. For today's theme, and I'm sure many of you know this, there are really 2 salient facts about Rwanda. First, this was an unambiguous genocide. In 100 days, you saw a state orchestrate the destruction of at least 500,000 civilian lives, and they specifically targeted the Tutsi minority in Rwanda. 500,000 people in 100 days. But second, as this violence engulfed Rwanda, the international decision, the coordinated international decision, was to get out. Despite having a UN peacekeeping force on the ground, despite having a force commander of that peacekeeping unit that wanted to intervene and was asking for support, and despite warning signs that something like this could happen. Okay. So Rwanda, in short, was a massive failure at any promise of a new world order where genocide prevention, stopping mass atrocities, protecting lots of civilians could be realized. Then, of course, we have a year later, Srebrenica. So this happens after several years of Serb and Bosnian Serb violence and manipulation of international actors. And here in Srebrenica, this is Ratko Mladic, the military commander of the Bosnian Serbs. You had, Srebrenica had been a so-called safe area declared by the UN. You had Dutch peacekeeping troops who were there, were trying to protect, or in theory, protecting civilians there. But the Bosnian Serbs came in. They effectively tied up and got the I wouldn't say consent, but they succeeded in getting the Dutch peacekeepers to allow them to proceed. They segregated out 7,000 to 8,000 Muslim boys and women and massacred them over a couple of days, quite a bit of sexual violence, and then sort of depopulated the area of Bosnian Serbs. Okay? This too was another huge failure and betrayal, the largest massacre, at least at that point, on European soil since World War II. And really, I think, showed people that this promise was empty or certainly problematic and something needed to change. Okay. So the next section that I want to talk about is sort of how people dealt with those failures, Rwanda and Bosnia in particular. Okay. I think in many respects, these two cases in particular prompted serious introspection. I believe sincere efforts to understand what the problems were and how they could be remedied. And in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of summarize what I think were some of the core developments in this period. And it's a period I would date from sort of 95, 96 to like 2015. So a kind of 20-year period of growth. And it's growth of what I've labeled up here, the sort of an emergent anti-atrocity regime. Okay? And I think this is the most significant developments toward ending genocide since World War II, this period of time. Now, I put forward this image of Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, because I think at some level he's not the only person, but he was actually quite instrumental at shepherding a bunch of different elements of change at the international level in particular. He had been the head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations during the Rwandan genocide, then was also very involved with Bosnia and Srebrenica. And I think that as he experienced those things, and then when he became Secretary General, he was deeply committed, I believe, to finding a better way, to learning about what it is that, why it was that these things happen and what could be different in the world order. So again, it's a much broader endeavor, but in some ways, I think he's an important figure in this story. So what I want to describe here are, again, a set of interventions that, while they were nonetheless not like the core priority in world politics, nonetheless represented a set of changes in the background that formed the building blocks of this anti-atrocity regime. Okay, and the reason I'm doing this is I think we need to recognize what was accomplished, because if we don't, it's going to go away. So one set of issues was the question of norms. And I mean that pretty broadly. The big issue when some of these crimes happened was the question of political will. The basic concern was people didn't care. Not only citizens didn't care, but heads of state didn't care. It wasn't a priority at the United Nations, etc. And so after these cases, you saw a kind of deliberate effort on the part of governments, on the part of the UN, on the part of regional organizations, as well as within different civil society organizations to basically declare that they stood for a world without genocide, or they stood for the principle of genocide prevention, that it was in the national interest in different ways. And I think this coincided with a broader kind of accounting for the past, a broader sense of transitional justice, which I'll get to in just a second, that I think was quite important. So I think there was a development of norms or a clarification of norms. I think the second big change was the development of a set of policy frameworks. I mean, when Rwanda happened and Bosnia happened, there was actually no policy against genocide. You had the Genocide Convention. You had a broad sense that people were against this idea, against the idea of genocide, but there was no direct policy framework. And moreover, there was a problem. There was a contradiction at the heart of the Genocide Convention and the heart of this effort, which is that in international law, there is the protection of sovereignty, and then you have the commitment to undertake to prevent genocide, which implies the non-consensual intervention to protect people from genocide. And this was a problem that emerged in the former Yugoslavia, especially, and something that Kofi Annan was quite focused on. So he, largely, not just him, but he, I think, led a process to establish the new doctrine of what Dan talked about, responsibility to protect, which at the most fundamental level sought to deal with this contradiction, however successfully or not. That was part of one effort at the UN. I think also at the UN, there was an effort to rethink peacekeeping, and in particular to develop civilian protection mandates and to blue hat, that is to constitute peacekeeping missions under a different chapter of the UN, and then to give them the size and intelligence, et cetera, to be able to be more effective at civilian protection. There was a standing up of a set of institutions within the UN, et cetera. Within the United States, you had similar initiatives. In the United States in particular, there was something called PSD-10 under President Obama, which among other things created an interagency institution called the Atrocity Prevention Board. US officials got trained in atrocity prevention. There was the development of a set of early warning projects. Genocide and atrocities became part of security assessments, intelligence assessments. It was kind of baked into the apparatus of the state in the United States, which had never happened before. There was also conceptual improvement. I won't necessarily talk about this that long, but one of the traps, and we've seen this with Gaza, that people got into, whether it be Rwanda or Bosnia or Darfur or in the early Darfur, was whether something is genocide or not. And the problem from a prevention point of view is that by the time you're really clear that it's genocide, it's very late in the day. And there also are lots of cases of mass atrocities where lots and lots of civilians are deliberately killed that aren't necessarily genocide, but from a policy standpoint, they matter just as much. And so there was an effort to rethink some of the frameworks that were used, which again, I'm happy to speak about. And then lastly, there were stronger toolkits. In the 90s, there was like, send in the troops, military intervention or nothing. And I think there was an effort to really develop a set of principles around non-military mechanisms. So those ranged from better early warning and forecasting and documentation using cell phones, using satellites, et cetera, to more effective documentation and reporting and what people in the human rights community call naming and shaming. There were investments in kind of what people called crisis diplomacy and other sort of forms of diplomatic effort, like as crises were emerging, send diplomats there to try to mitigate them. There was also the development of sanctions. Most of the sanctions that had occurred in the 80s and 90s were broad-based trade sanctions. There was the development of so-called smart sanctions or individualized sanctions, both financial, travel, and other forms of sanctions. And then there were improvements to peacekeeping, as noted. And then even on the military side, there was a lot of kind of operational development of measures that could be used that would be short of like overthrowing the regime. So these were important developments. I think the most significant developments were around questions of justice. And there's been a huge revolution in legal accountability since the 90s. Some people call this the justice cascade. It's part of a broader effort at truth commissions, memorialization, public education, a whole range of efforts at acknowledging victims and signaling and coordinating norms. And parts of this, as I said earlier, I think Germany does better than anybody, honestly. But from the point of view of criminal accountability, I think you've seen a wave of developments. After Nuremberg, there was no criminal accountability for atrocity crimes and genocide. That changed with the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, and then for Rwanda, then for Sierra Leone, and eventually for Cambodia. And then there was the formation of the International Criminal Court, which is the standing permanent body for these kinds of crimes. Then you also have national courts, which got involved in this. And this is in Germany. We're talking about this at dinner. But a number of other countries where you had defendants that committed atrocities, if they were on the soil of those countries, were often prosecuted. Okay. And then most recently, and kind of very surprisingly, you also have the International Court of Justice, which has emerged as an arena in the last 6 or 7 years as a place where some of these issues are debated. The International Court of Justice is not a criminal court. It's a court of dispute between states. And what's been happening is one state will bring a genocide case against another state to say that it's culpable for genocide in X and Y situation. And right now there are, I think, 3 or 4 major cases before the ICJ as well. Okay, anyway, each of these developments has issues. I'm happy to talk about them. But in sum, if you compare what the international architecture for genocide prevention was at the end of the Cold War to where it was in 2015, I think there was substantial multi-layered progress amounting to what I think is the emergence of an anti-atrocity regime, one that stood apart but intersected with broader human rights concerns. I understand the cynical response. It's a lot of hot air. I understand that the commitments were not that robust. They were not necessarily top priorities. I also understand how dispiriting some cases were in this period, whether that be Syria, whether that be South Sudan, whether that be Myanmar or China, and so forth. But I do think this was the most concentrated progress on genocide prevention ever. And in my view, it came from sincere efforts to change the status quo and learn from past failures, and we're at serious risk of losing that progress. So let me just pause for 1 second. Okay, if there is ever a future where we can return to these ideals, we should be able to provide an honest assessment of what was good and bad about this anti-atrocity regime, if you accept that term. Now, this is a difficult issue to study, and it's a difficult issue to study for what we call in political science kind of selection problems. Like, we don't really know what the counterfactuals are here. Nonetheless, I would say that I would like to advance kind of 3 observations or 3 initial assessments. I'm still working through some of this, but I present this as food for thought. First of all, this is an incredibly difficult problem to solve. And to sort of quote Dan, who quoted Samantha Power, it is a problem from hell. When you have dedicated perpetrators who really want to commit mass violence and see it as central, existential for their survival, it's very difficult to deter them or compel them to change. The second thing that I think we have to acknowledge is that the use of force is really problematic. It's also very difficult to get agreement on it, but then it has all kinds of problems in its wake. Okay? But, and here's where I want to stress, I do think state leaders who are either committing or on the verge of committing atrocities tend to be sensitive, or some of them are sensitive to reputational, diplomatic, financial, and judicial costs. That is, the non-military apparatus that was developed, documentation, naming and shaming, diplomacy, etc., imposes risks and costs that shape the calculus of many states engaging in mass violence. Okay? These are mechanisms that work best when you have international consensus and cooperation, which is extremely difficult to achieve. And they only work in some circumstances and not in all. But the point is that it's worth it. In other words, that there can be effectiveness here. Okay, now, the contemporary crisis, and I'm working towards my conclusion. I don't know how long I've been going on, but I thank you for your patience. So I think it will come as no surprise to many of you that we're facing a deep crisis in this agenda. And certainly, and it's interesting at dinner, I think, we all sort of speak from where we sit. And I sit in the United States, and it's really difficult right now if you care about these issues. But I do think we are watching the undoing of the consensus and cooperation that underpin the progress that I've just outlined. And I think in reflecting on this, I think there are both kind of general and specific problems to acknowledge. I think on the general side, the foundations of international order and cooperation put into place after World War II are being unraveled. And the United States is a big part of this, I'm ashamed to say. The Trump administration is actively undermining the institutions that it helped create after the war to advance its own interests: the UN, NATO, international law, free trade, and the like. Trump says the only restraint that exists on the international scene is his own morality. There is really no such thing as international law. Openly flaunts international law. And we, of course, have the shocking social media statement about destroying a civilization, but it's not the first thing. There's no respect for international law, no respect for international humanitarian law, no respect for human rights from this administration. So we can look around to other states in the world, and Russia is another big one. And Russia, too, I think this is not on the agenda for Russia. It invaded Ukraine. It wants to annex Ukraine. It wants to destroy Ukraine, or at least make it part of Russia. And in the course of that war has also committed quite severe atrocities. Then, as I'll discuss towards the end, you've all the emerging powers, or the now emerged power of places like China and India and Brazil and Nigeria. And I don't see this on their agenda either. And by this, I mean both genocide prevention and the broader sense of international law. But there are also specific atrocity prevention issues and problems that I think have to be acknowledged as part of any reckoning. I think these are different issues and they overlap, and I want to kind of isolate several problems. I think first, from a global perspective, if one assumes that international cooperation is central to the effectiveness of this agenda, there is a strong current of thought that this is fundamentally a global North project, one that is often replete with hypocrisy, and one that is often a cover for projecting power and advancing the interests of the powerful. Whether or not we agree with that assessment, that is a common assessment in much of the global South. A second big problem that is related to that, in my view, is Libya. I think in Libya we had an international military effort involving NATO to protect civilian populations at risk from slaughter by Gaddafi. It was officially a responsibility to protect operation. And while I think one can make the argument, and I would make this argument, that that intervention saved a lot of lives in the short term, in the long term, in the aftermath, the effects were disastrous. And so I think in thinking about this agenda, you have to account for the aftermath of Libya and the consequences there. I think third is that in this space, a lot of change and energy comes from civil society. And that was true in Darfur. I think a lot of where we have gotten progress at different points, civil society has been key, and this is typical for human rights, broadly speaking. But I think today the principled actors who would theoretically be champions of this issue are focused on other major existential questions. They're thinking about democracy at home. They're thinking about human rights at home for people who are facing detention or whatever. They're thinking about equality. They're thinking about climate change. These are non-trivial issues that demand the attention of many would-be activists on this issue. And fourth, I think it pains me to say it, but an issue that I think crystallizes several of these concerns has to do with Israel's war in Gaza. In this case, you had mass movements around the world, though they had multiple messages. One of the messages was there was genocide happening in Gaza. And oftentimes that message was met with outright hostility, including on campuses and sometimes leading to the criminalization of those who are making those claims. We also had the same old problem of like fighting over, is it genocide, is it not? The bottom line, I think it's very hard for any civil society movement to mount an anti-genocide campaign because the immediate response would be, well, what about Gaza? Or how do we deal with the legacy of Gaza? Or people who didn't care about Gaza, etc. And so there's also the question of double standards, of powerful states backing Israel as it was destroying much of Gaza. So I think these are serious headwinds. Each of these issues are non-trivial on their own. Okay? So let me kind of come to my conclusion here. My assessment of the future is bleak, unfortunately. When I look at the past, as I said, change has come from principled actors who made it their mission, people who are within states and people who are without states. And when I look at today's landscape, I don't see where that leadership and that energy is going to come from. We can look to a post-Trump future, but the damage to confidence in American leadership and commitment to international law, to cooperation, to human rights is substantial. The United States, I think, no longer predictably stands for the order it made. Russia, as I said, wants to destroy Ukraine and absorb it. China, I think, is reputationally sensitive, but these issues are not central to its interests or to its identity or to its foreign policy. We are in an emerging multipolar world, maybe war, but a multipolar world. And many of the emerging states, even those that had the histories of mass atrocities in them, places like Pakistan, Indonesia, India, Turkey, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, they are not making this a campaign. Okay. Other countries that are emerging powers, the UAE, Saudi, Qatar, etc., I don't see them championing this issue. Europe is probably where the leadership would come from. Europe and Canada, maybe. I'm not super optimistic. You will be the experts, not me. But there seems to be very grave domestic political crises in Europe. This is not an outward-looking phase in Europe, I say from the vantage point of the United States. Non-state actors, again, I think that Gaza was very deflating. So I think all of this points to a decline of the salience and importance of this agenda. Okay. However, things do change. It's difficult to see it now, and I have no idea how things will change, but none of this is truth forever. Okay? On the bright side, the architecture of the progress that I underlined in this talk, I think still exists. In some ways, the judicial mechanisms are more sophisticated than they have ever been. Like the quality of the jurisprudence, the quality of the argumentation in law is at a very high level now. The quality of the documentation, the quality of the technology for that documentation, the reporting structures are all significantly better. Our ability to communicate is much faster and cheaper, and all those things are also real. The laws, the policy frameworks, not the norms, I'll come to that in a second, the institutions, the tools, they all still exist. They're not dead yet. And there remain pockets of people who care. Probably some of you are in this room. And I think we should fight to retain and reinforce these elements. We should not be blind to their limitations. We should not oversell or overpromise. This is a so-called problem from hell. And many efforts did not yield good results. We have to be honest about that, okay? Anyways. But so not to be overly dramatic, and here's where I'll end. Give it a second. I think the ultimate challenge is the normative one. I think we have to answer the question, why does this matter? Now, there are realist answers to that question, realist frameworks about why that matters. I could rehearse them for you, but I don't think they're super strong arguments. Okay? Rather, I think the arguments that will carry the day are normative in nature and constructivist in nature. Okay? So this is not my area. I am an empirical social scientist that studies genocide. I don't develop moral philosophy about the value of human life. So I'm on thinner ground here, but my analysis is that if we need to be making these arguments. I think we have to ask, what are the values that should underpin our world? How can we learn from the past? And in that vein, I want to sort of sketch out an answer. Again, this is the part of the talk that is very, I think, preliminary. But as I've thought about this, basically, I want to live in a world where we pay attention and try to stop genocide and mass atrocities wherever they happen or might happen, even if we cannot stop them. To turn away from this violence is to close ourselves off to the suffering of others and to close ourselves off to an ethical relationship to the world. It is also, or would be, turning our back not only on the Holocaust, but on Rwanda, on Bosnia, on Cambodia, on Sudan, etc. And of course, it would be turning our back on the memory of those who died or were survived or otherwise were victimized. Okay. Now, speaking out against atrocities and acting to prevent or account for them, I think also has value in and of itself. That is, by articulating these values, we are trying to construct the world we want around us, trying to construct a world with meaning, a world that we want. Again, there is no case that I've spent 25 years studying this issue. There is no case that I have observed that is more dedicated to this than here, around the memory of the Holocaust in particular. There has been a deep reflection about what permitted genocide to happen and what we must learn from that past. And I think it's important to recover some of that messaging, some of that. It can be heavy-handed, a little bit less, not so much here, but here is an image from Sachsenhausen. And the lesson is the dignity of every human being is inviolable. Now, we know that's not how the world works, right? People's dignity is violated all the time, okay? But it's the world we should try to effectuate. It is what actually stands the polar opposite to what happened here in World War II. And I think even if we fail, we should appreciate the ethical power and constructive power of standing up for those principles. So, to conclude, I think that it can be easy to be cynical about the period of growth that I described. Many, if not most of my colleagues are. It was a blip in time. It was a unipolar moment. It was idealistic. It didn't matter. But I want to guard against that interpretation and that cynicism and try to recover the inherent value for insisting on the importance of preventing genocide and taking stock and appreciating the progress that was made in this space. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Scott, thank you for a terrific and impassioned speech. We don't have that much time, so I'm just going to ask a few. That's okay. You shouldn't. How long did I go? Long enough. Sorry. This is perfect. A few quick questions to get us going. I am interested in how the air went out of the tires of this effort. It seems to, let me throw out a few propositions and you tell me why I'm right or wrong. There was an inherent challenge in genocide prevention from the get-go because of the way Lemkin wrote the convention, namely the obligation to prevent and punish. And I'm not sure he should have done it any differently, but at the end of the day, that meant every state had to consider under what circumstances it would put its own troops in harm's way, something that is profoundly unpopular in most democratic societies. And therefore, we were set up for an enormous challenge from the get-go. And we found that out the hard way, especially after what was a kind of minor debacle in Somalia led to a major debacle in Rwanda. Yeah. So why don't we start right there? I guess the other question, other factors that took the air out of the tires, you and I talked about this a bit yesterday, simply the fact that we get farther and farther away from the Holocaust with every passing year. Yeah. The Holocaust was an organizing fact of modern life. Perhaps those two things, the fact that sacrifice was involved and that the Holocaust itself was, after a very intense period of attention beginning in the late 70s, has become more and more of a historical artifact.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, plug him back in.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think on the first issue, I think the biggest problem with the Genocide Convention was that it was not specific about what it meant to undertake to prevent. Mm-hmm. And basically, the language of the convention is you go to the competent organs of the United Nations, and people understood the Genocide Convention to actually obligate states to intervene, but actually is not what the obligation was. And so, in a way, I would underline a slightly different issue, which is that it was not clear there was no specificity to that obligation. I think the military, the use of force to stop genocide is a last resort. And it is difficult to get people to have consensus, and it causes a lot of problems. Right. And I think we have this conversation and this agenda will be much more successful if we point to the non-military mechanisms. I don't think Lemkin had a clear idea here. I think Lemkin was a bit naive about international law. I think he thought if you get an international law, it will stop. He had, I think, the optimism of a lawyer who believed in the law, which is great. But international law doesn't work that way. And I think that was his myopia, or one of them. Somalia was, all of those 90s interventions, when you look back, I think the interveners were not prepared. They were not prepared politically. They were not prepared with the right information. They did not have a clear understanding of what it was they were doing. The peacekeeping missions were improperly formatted in the sense they had the wrong chapter. They had not enough people. I mean, the famous story of Romeo Dallaire, you know, getting the assignment and then going to a bookstore to get a tourist map of Rwanda. I mean, that just shows the level of ignorance. That's not his fault, but it was the level of ignorance to the situation they were walking into. I think we've come a long way from there. I really do. And that was one of the points I was trying to make. And that's what's so hard to watch it feel like it's going up in smoke. I think the Holocaust question is really fundamental, and I don't have a good answer. I mean, anyone who's been in a 5-minute conversation with me over the last few days will know I've been truly blown away. I don't know what the right term is, technical term. Been extremely impressed with the quality and extensiveness of memorialization here. There, it's present in a way that it's not in other places. But what I don't see are, who else, and this is part of the point, who else is going to take up this case? Who else is going to care about this issue enough to want to make a difference?
Right. I keep thinking of Mark Carney's remark about the middle powers.
Yeah, I think that's one scenario.
Yeah.
One scenario is there's a kind of like-minded set of states that will make this part of their rules-based order.
Yeah. And then they come up against superpowers that may or may not have spheres of influence, but it's another challenge.
Yeah.
On the military piece, to go to the head in the other direction chronologically, I don't know if this has gotten any discussion in human rights, anti-genocide circles, but the rise of drones and autonomous weapons ought to be revolutionary here too, if anyone were to devote the resources to thinking about how to deploy them in these circumstances.
It's a really good question. I have not seen that, and maybe it exists. Where I have seen is sort of, the sort of, it's your next book, the sort of cyber efforts. That is, like, there are ways of disrupting the perpetration of atrocities using cyber attacks, essentially, or cyber disruption. So I do think the technological opportunities are much greater than they were.
And the last question I'll ask at least right now, about the loss of interest has to do with our everyday experience of simply feeling like we're surrounded by so many atrocities. Where do you start?
Yeah.
I mean,
I mean, look, again, I hear that. I mean, I think, there are very significant crises in just the region that I study. It's Congo, it's Somalia, it's Ethiopia, it's parts of the Sahel, it's Sudan. And beyond that, Ukraine, the Uyghurs, Myanmar remains a complicated issue. We had Syria, I mean, not now, but for a long period of time. I think that's why I ended the way I did.
Right.
Because the only answer, I think, to that question, because you cannot stop all of these crimes, but I think what you can do is try to stop them.
And create some inhibitions for others who do it. Let's open it up.
Well, thank you so much.
Wait for
my name is Martin Klingst.
No, wait for the mic.
My name is Martin Klingst. I used to be a journalist and was very much involved also in the Balkan Wars and also in the Near East. I have a question because I think there is a systematic problem. You pointed out the hypocrisies, but you also pointed out the fight between Lauterpacht and Lemkin. The structural or systemic problem is in the convention, the Genocide Convention, because if you invoke genocide, or one of the member states of the Genocide Convention claims that another country committed genocide, it automatically goes to the International Court of Justice. It does not need consent by the party being accused. This is only for genocide. It's not for crimes against humanity or for war crimes. There, you always need the consent. When you go to the International Court of Justice, when you go to the International Criminal Court, you need, offenders, you need perpetrators. So this is a long term. With the International Court of Justice, you can bring an actual issue to the court and discuss it. So the problem is that genocide, being regarded as the crime of the crime, is always invoked when mass atrocities are committed without actually always being genocide, which makes it a problem because it's going to be used as a political tool, which makes it problematic in order to actually say it's a crime against humanity or it's a war crime, because it's covered by the frame genocide.
Yeah.
Do you see that problem?
Absolutely. And this was an aspect that I spoke about, but very quickly, which is I do think, so let's take the ICJ and put that over here for a second. But I think the conventions in this way suffers in three different ways. Okay. One is this idea of the crime of crimes, in which it creates a kind of invisibility for other types of mass violence against civilian populations, right? It has to be genocide or we don't care, right? That is a very problematic construction. And I think we've seen that problem repeat itself over and over again. There was, in the progress I was trying to trace out, there was an effort to broaden out the framework to mass atrocities, atrocity crimes, which include crimes against humanity, include certain kinds of war crimes and so forth. The second problem with the Genocide Convention is the delineation of four categories for protection: racial, ethnic, national, and religious groups. But there are other groups that one would want to care about that might face destruction. And then the last issue is this question, like they could be an economic group, a political group, a gender group, a sexuality group, a regional group, some type of people with left-handed, whatever. I mean, I think the third issue with the convention is that is the proof of intent. And so the convention, pivots on the idea that you have to establish this intent to destroy in whole or in part. And from the point of view of prevention, what you need to establish that intent is often so substantial that so much destruction has already happened that you're not really preventing at that point. Okay. So I think that the reflection about those problems, which was really evident in Rwanda, was really evident in the former Yugoslavia, this anti-atrocity regime I was trying to trace out, it used a slightly different framework, which was atrocities. And I think for good reason. Now, atrocities at the same time don't have the same cachet. They don't have the same resonance. You can't invoke the Holocaust in the same way as well. Anyway, so I think that's interesting. Now, the ICJ is not historically it's not really a tool of prevention. I mean, and you do need a country to bring a case. So the first, as you may know, if you've been focused on the former Yugoslavia, the first was brought by Bosnia against Serbia, but many years after, a decade after. And the cases before the court now, whether it be Israel, Ukraine, or Myanmar, it's very slow. This is not a court for prevention in that sense. So anyway, I agree with you. I don't know that I would put the focus on the ICJ as such, as the problem per se.
It's really the Security Council.
Not the ICJ, but the convention, because it's in the convention that the ICJ automatically is, invoked once a country brings it to the ICJ.
Yeah.
Stephen.
Thanks, Scott. That was a great talk. You're trying to broaden the definition of atrocity, but it seems to me you're still keeping the idea that an atrocity against members of a single group is somehow morally different from mass atrocity against a mixed population. So what's the moral reason for that distinction?
No, I wouldn't make that distinction. I mean, I think from an ethical standpoint, what we should care about is massive violence against civilian populations, full stop. It should be about mass atrocities.
So you're giving up on the Genocide Convention completely because that's the basic.
I'm not giving up on the Genocide Convention. I mean, I think genocide is a phenomenon. So I think there is a real thing that happens where usually states, but other types of authorities will try to eliminate a group. And so I think the term is valid and we should retain it. But from a policy and normative standpoint, we should care about the mass destruction of civilian lives, of human lives. I closed my talk, I think, coming back to Germany and the Holocaust, and because I think the reflection about what happened here in World War II came up with things like what really matters is the human right of every human being. That's, I think, the right core ethical principle. And so if I
But you don't think that was Lemkin's principle?
No, Lemkin had a different principle. For Lemkin, groups had an inherent value. And this is one of the contradictions of Lemkin. For Lemkin, it was, a bit of like survival of, the groups have inherent value and we need to fight for them to survive. Like he was worried about the disappearance of certain groups that would be a loss to world culture in some way, was an argument that he often made. So I do think from a policy and an ethical point of view, to get focused only on destruction aimed at groups is very limited. But that's not to say that there isn't such a thing as the effort to destroy groups that we should care about, right? That's the line I'm trying to walk, yeah.
I'm going to go all the way in the corner.
Hello, thank you for your insightful talk. I'm an American Studies scholar here in Berlin, and I wanted to ask you how you evaluate the role of mass media in the discourse of genocide, because in our times we are witnessing the coverage of war crimes and genocide as never before. We have all kinds of footage in the news, on social media. We also have documentations like Khartoum on the genocide in Sudan that came out last year, or 2,000 meters to Andriivka. And I mentioned this because you also mentioned the satellite images of the genocide in Sudan. So my question is, when it comes to this type of coverage and exposure of broad masses and public to these crimes, how do you think does it contribute to the civil, battle against genocide, or does it numbs and desensitize people instead? Thank you.
I mean, it's a fundamental question. I think the things that I can say, and I think there's more to say, but the things that I would observe are the fragmentation of the media space means that there is not, very few people are getting the same information. And so if I think about Sudan today versus 20 years ago, there was a kind of authoritative documentation through the media that I don't think exists for young people in the same way today. It's a much more fragmented information delivery system. And so I don't think, and any two people in the same room could have completely different feeds about what it is that's happening in the world at any given time. So I think if we think about social movements as, generating, sort of people agreeing on the same set of facts and acting on them, I think it's more difficult in the current social media landscape. At the same time, our access to that information is revolutionarily different. Like there is so much more information, and maybe this was your point. we could spend the next 5 hours looking at what's happening in one part of Sudan. So I think the fragmentation of the media landscape is working against the emergence of a movement, I would say. I think then there's the second issue, to Dan's point, which is there's just a lot of things on people's agenda right now. I think that, at least in the United States, where I can make observations, I think my students are worried that they're going to not have an election next year, or this year and in 2028. And they're worried about whether they're going to have a job because of AI when they graduate. And they're worried about whether or not there's, the climate, you're going to have children because of climate change. And maybe one always has those challenges, but I think in that context, it's very difficult for the crimes that I'm describing to rise to the top. That's my observation. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And also the problem of anesthetization.
Yeah.
A long word for just feeling numb from seeing too much.
Yeah.
So I want to go to someone who has sent in a question, which seems to be quite an interesting one. This viewer has heard that some of the states in the global south are becoming more interested in international laws. It gives them power to get their way. Is that your impression as well? And shouldn't the South be incorporated into efforts to reestablish or strengthen international law? I think of the case actually at the ICJ regarding Israel seems to be a case that's attracting a lot of interest in the global South, ironically, and it would be a huge historical irony if that became the thing that got them involved.
Yeah. Sovereignty, it depends on which international law we're talking about. Sovereignty protections, which are bedrock of international law, protect, in theory, the weak from the strong. That's not happening as much anymore. But I think I don't see an embrace of I don't see actors in the global South overall embracing international law as the way to build the next world order. And not to say it's not happening, but that's not what I see. I think my sense, at least in the regions where I spend time, it's much more focused on material power, much more focused on attracting better economic deals, population growth, markets, etc. The ICJ cases are interesting. The one against and maybe this is a valid point whoever asked the question is making. The case against Myanmar was brought by the Gambia. And the Gambia, in a way, probably is a case that fits my sort of analysis of what we're lacking, which is to say this was a country that transitioned from a brutal dictatorship in a period of hope and reckoning with the past. They embraced the idea of a sort of anti-atrocity, human rights vision, and brought the case to the ICJ on behalf of the Organization of Islamic States because the targets of violence in Myanmar are Muslim. The South Africa case that brought against Israel, I think, I don't know. It could be a turning point. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard to say.
Sabrina?
Thanks so much.
Wait for the mic. You should know that by now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Scott. This is a great talk. So I wanted to ask you, based off of Anne Applebaum wrote an Atlantic piece on Sudan, the most nihilistic war. And in it, she makes this case for that we've entered into this transactional world order.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you think that there is a space for atrocity prevention if she's right, or if this is a new world order of transactions. Is there a space for that within this world order, or are we just waiting for a liberal turn again for a liberal world order again where this would fit nicely?
It's a great question. I mean, it's in a way is related to like kind of the drone question, which is, first of all, I don't know what our world order is anymore. And it's like, is it transactional? Is it spheres of influence? Is it multipolar? Is it nonpolar? And I don't mean that glibly, but it's difficult. We are in a period of change, and it's hard for me to see what is on the other side right now. Now, if it's a transactional order, I have to think about that. It's not something that seems to lend itself to these ideals, unless you could show that it was somehow beneficial in some fashion to the would-be state that would commit the violence. And maybe there is an argument there, and I haven't thought it through, but it's a really interesting question. I was going to say something else, but it came out of my mind.
You could sort of imagine if there is there was the non-aligned movement in the 50s. If there is the middle powers in the 2020s, you could imagine them being transactional in this regard, or at least, they would be an anti-genocide presence within a world of aggrandizing powers. Who knows?
Yeah, I think that for sure, which is to say that, if what we're going to see is some sense of like there are multiple, not spheres of influence in the way that people think about it, which is to say like, South America belongs to the United States as a sphere of influence. Eastern Europe belongs to Russia as a sphere of influence, etc. And more the idea that there are kind of multiple sources of pressure in the world with a bunch of competing visions. And there's one that emerges that says, a better world, the world that we want to make is one where, human rights, atrocities, etc., are constitutive to that world. Then I think that, and there's transaction between those actors to make that commitment. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, you.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. Reginka Ivo, happens to be a public international lawyer and banking lawyer. Speaking in an international context, only the two questions of mine. Would it help perhaps in a world where no one's abiding apparently with the prevention of such genocidal or other atrocities, help to rather be creative and think of having either the middle-sized countries go ahead and, let's say, create, even in terms of making forcible engagements on the basis of responsibility to protect a UN resolution in Libya, although a one-time resolution, but making it perhaps a basis for international customary law to evolve out of that. If someone would go forward and at least on short-term basis, move in, create short havens of hope, so to speak, to save whatever human lives and in a certain camp, where the atrocities are taking place, move out immediately again in order to not have a prolonged conflict. And the second question would be, in terms of transactions, would it help, well, perhaps in alluding to Oskar Schindler, to bail out such prisoners? Would it help? We happen to have the financial resources, don't we?
That's an interesting question. I think let me take your second question first, and then make sure I understand your first question. Most of the way that this has been conceptualized in sort of policy frameworks is about the imposing of financial costs, rather than the creation of financial incentives. So if you want to change the direction of what's happening, you impose financial costs. I think the various efforts, let's say, to offer someone, here's a position at Harvard, you can no longer be the head of state and prosecuting atrocity crimes, and let's give you a fellowship at the Institute of Politics or something like that, or other versions of that, generally have not worked. But whether or not there would be a big enough amount of money, I don't know. It gets into tricky territory. You're going to pay off people. Then it's a kind of ransoming. It's a kind of kidnapping of populations, and strategic actors could think, well, if I could just put populations at threat, maybe I could get a payoff at the end of the day. So I think there would be a moral hazard as I think it through. I think there would be a significant moral hazard to that approach. Do you mind repeating the first question? Is the question like, is there an international customary law that's forming?
No,
Yeah.
The resolution, the UN resolution on responsibility to protect
Yeah.
was used only in Libya as far as I know. It caused all the difficulties that you mentioned. Nevertheless, it could spark potentially the basis for other actors, other state actors moving forward on this basis and saying, well, why not move into Sudan only on a short-term basis, establish an harbor of hope, so to speak, allow for 1 million people to flee to that harbor, then move out immediately within, let's say, 20 days time period or so. Once they have passed the border or are in a neighboring country, they're in a safe harbor, so to speak. You have, of course, it could serve as a preventive measure, although it's a violation of international law.
Just a small point. Responsibility to protect was invoked in two other important cases. One was in Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa, and one was in Kenya in the post-election crisis, both of which were much more successful than the Libya case, because I think that's important to note. It could be. I think that the problem is that no one is really, no one is putting attention on Sudan. No one is developing significant energy toward either trying to protect people or to a way out of this crisis. There's the so-called Quad. There are these diplomatic efforts that are half-hearted, and the actors involved in this crisis, a lot of the external, including the external actors, including the UAE, especially, I think are not interested in resolving it. They see that their interests are in backing a particular group, carving out a zone of influence, and in light of what I was describing, which is that there is an incredibly weak response to that, they have a big green light. That's how I see the situation. But could responsibility to protect be invoked? Could there be creative solutions to protecting populations? Absolutely. But you need people to care.
So there are lots of hands up, and there are very few minutes left. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to encourage you all to buttonhole Scott during dessert. I did an event in the U.S. last week, and my wife said to me afterward, "You didn't end on a positive note." We were talking mostly about the consequences of Iran. I said, "Well, I couldn't think of any at the moment." I would like to think that there will be countries that, out of enlightened self-interest, will want to undertake be much more vigorous in the efforts to combat genocide and mass atrocities. And I've been thinking a lot, as I'm sure Europeans are, of the disaster that befell Europe after, you had millions and millions of people flooding in from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan in 2015 and thereabouts. There are 95 million Iranians, and I have a pretty good feeling that about 92 million of them would like to be living somewhere else right now.
Yeah.
And those kind of calculations perhaps will point people back towards taking seriously the dignity of the individual. Let's hope.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that I think we have to be making these arguments because if we don't, it's going to be a world of violence. It's going to be a horrible world, and we've learned that lesson once.
All right. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to close it there.